Pray. Holy God, when we are afraid, when we're unsure, when it appears that things are not going the way that we thought they were supposed to go, remind us to look up again, to look up to your promises, to your presence, and to believe. Set your Spirit upon us this morning as we engage with your word, that the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts may be pleasing and acceptable to you, O Lord, our rock and our Redeemer. God's story, our story. It's our theme for the year, and we're in Genesis. It's the prequel, if you remember from last year, the prequel to the story, the Exodus story. And Exodus is the heart of where God's story and our story overlap. It's where we first come together and we study the Scriptures to discover who this God is that's invited us into the story. And we study the Scriptures in order to learn more about this life, this story that God has invited us into that's worth living. We often think, as we're studying the Scriptures, that it's a process of looking back to see what has once happened before and to understand that. And so I want to share with you what I wrote from my introduction to our theme for this year to give you a little bit of a taste of what we're going to try to do from time to time with our sermon ministry here at Parkside this year. So here's what I wrote. What if we change the perspective, and instead of imagining that we're looking back, we place our feet in the shoes of our religious ancestors and then look forward? After all, we are the future for the community of God in Scripture. We are the product of their sacrifice and hard work. We are the vision and hope for what the gospel could do for the world. Now, that might excite you in one sense. It might also scare you in another. So with that in mind, I finish with my writing here, we might ask, what would someone like Abram, or Abraham as we know him, say if he caught a glimpse of us? So hold on just a second. I see you're up to my story in the Scriptures. It's the portion that you're reading about my practicality, I see, in Genesis 15. After all, God had promised to bless me and make a great nation out of me and Sarah. I had no children, and I'm old. Well, I'm 75 years old, and that may be young for some of you, but it's kind of old to start a family. Feels old to me most of the time. So if a nation isn't going to come from my offspring, then we better start with my favorite servant. I'll make my servant my heir. His name is Eliezer. Before I tell you about what happens with Eliezer and my plans, my practical plans of my servant being my heir, I think I need to tell you a little bit more about that promise that we heard about. You see, God shows up. I'm living my life just the way everybody always lives their life. And God shows up and He says to me, go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. Now, the first thing you have to know is that God didn't just walk up to me and start talking. Does he do that with you? Does God just walk up, you see God, and he starts talking with you? He didn't do that with me either. I think you imagine that that's how it went for me, but it's not how it went for me. We'd be pretty clear in that when other parts of this story that you'll read about, we're told that if anybody sees God, they're dead. I lived. God didn't just show up and start talking to me. Well, what was it like? It's more like a premonition. Have you ever been 100% sure that you needed to do something? Well, that was God speaking to me. I was 100% sure in my guts that I needed to leave my dad and my kindred and my house and go to this place. And you know what? I didn't even really know where I was going yet. But I was sure I had to go. But here's the thing. I look out at you and I see that doesn't shock you. That kind of sounds normal. You seem like people that move around and do stuff. Let me tell you, that wasn't normal for me. This is how my life went and my culture and everybody around me, right? It goes like this. Dad has a son, and we grow up, and then we grow and we marry, and then we build a house onto Dad's house. And then we have kids. And then we take over. And then our kids grow up. And our son has a family. And then they have kids. And they add on to the house. You know how big Dad's house was? It was huge. Because we just kept going around in a circle in which everybody kept adding on to Dad's house. And we had kids. And we added on. And this was the culture. We just lived in this circle. And God says, get out of the circle. I'm calling you out of the cycle. I'm calling you out of the rut that you've put into the ground of this circle of family. And that is crazy. Because everybody does what I just described to you. We all add on to Dad's house. We all have kids. We take over the business, and then we add on to the house some more. Because family is what you can count on. Family is safety. Family is normalcy. And so there's safety in the circle. And God says to me, leave it. Get out of the cycle. I've got bigger things in store for you. And that's the first way that I recognized God in the impulse that said I needed to leave. It's the first voice of how I could recognize it was God's voice and not my own. Because you know what? I never would have done that. I was 75 years old. I had a well-worn track in the circle. I knew what my life was supposed to be. Do you think I wanted to start over? Of course it was God's voice. I wouldn't have even thought of it on my own. So what would I want you to know about God's story and our story? God calls you from within the normal, but out of the normal. God's call often comes to you when you feel safest and calls you out of that safety. God calls you out of the rut in your life, out of the cycle in your life, and into a greater course. As Abraham, that's what I want you to know from my story. When you're feeling like you're doing the same thing over and over, and maybe just hoping that something new will happen, God calls you to something new. That's my story. And I think it's your story when I see you folks. So keep your spirit open for God's Spirit. Keep your spirit open for how God might be calling you. Pay attention to the ruts in your life and listen for God's Spirit busting you out of it. It's scary. It scared the pants off me. Did you read that in Genesis 15? I was afraid. I was afraid, and you might be afraid too. But You don't get this big, bold, amazing life by living in and settling in to ruts. And let me tell you, it was hard for me. I was 75. Sarah was old too. We're going to leave and start over? Start over with our lives? It was the hardest thing we ever did. But you know what? It was the best thing we ever did. You exist because we did it. You're here because we said yes to the hardest thing we could imagine. Who might exist when you say yes? Who might come and fill churches and fill communities and do amazing things for God's kingdom because you say yes? I look out at you and see that you exist because I said yes. Who might exist when you say yes? Of course, we got halfway to nowhere pretty quickly, right? We said yes, and then we found ourselves in the middle of nothing, and we had no kids. I'd said yes, but now I'm old, and I have no place to lay my head at night, and I have no kids, and I have no prospects for any of them in the future. So I decided to do what we all do when the promises of God don't line up with the reality that we're experiencing, right? I got practical. When you dream big and the dreams don't seem to be coming true, what do? Get practical. Can you blame me? I mean, you might try to blame me, but how often do you get practical when God's big dreams don't seem to be coming true for you? It's interesting, right? So I called my favorite slave over and decided it should all go to him. He's my favorite. And maybe that's the way that the nation would get started. His name was Eliezer, after all. And you know what that means? Eliezer means God have mercy. So I'm a smart guy, pretty practical by nature. This is God's mercy. Here's God's mercy. The great nation will come through my faithful servant. And this is what you do. It's practical. But I should have remembered how God called me in the first place. He called me out of safety and practicality and into His mercy. Go to the place where I will show you. Didn't tell me where I was headed, just trust. Trust that my mercy will have a place for you. And so He called me into it. Eliezer wasn't my future. He was my reminder that my future belonged to God and God's mercy. God knew I was afraid. I've been afraid from the very first step out of the cycle that God called me from. And then it was like I saw clearly again, and I want to describe this for you because it's really important. I mean, you sometimes get Hollywoodized with your ideas of visions, right? But that's not really what it's about. Right? So I had this vision, or it was like a vision. I was out at night, and it was quiet. And you folk, I see how you folk live. You're crazy. You never have any darkness in your life? Never. Right? I mean, the lights are always on. They say that New York is a city that never sleeps, but you don't ever get dark around here. It never gets dark around here. It's light all the time. It's no wonder you lose your way. You never see any stars. It's too light out. Let me tell you about darkness. Darkness is sitting in the middle of the desert with no light at all. That's when visions come. We don't like to tell ourselves that, but that's the truth. Visions of God come when we're at the end of our rope, and we don't think there's anything else that we can look to. So it was night. It was dark. I couldn't see my hand in front of my face, but God brings me out of the tent, and he says, look up, and all I see is the sky exploding with light. The sky exploding with stars, and I slipped right back into the small cycle of a life, really no life at all, and God's saying, count the stars if you are able. So shall your descendants be. My imagination was captive to my practicality. I could only imagine as big as my practicalness would allow me. God's imagination exploded my captivity. God's imagination for how big my life might be blew my mind. And I knew right there that my future depended on God's magnitude, not my little visions. Eleazar, God have mercy indeed. So what would I say to you? There are going to be times when the promises that God has given you seem to burst and life ain't working the way we all dreamed. What do? It's tempting to get practical, which means essentially we pick the simplest technique that gets you through even as you sacrifice your dreams. That didn't work for me. Instead, I was brought back to that first call of God, that first big dream, that first exciting, fear-inducing leap of faith. And it energized me to go forward. I had decided to pour all of my energy into Eleazar. That was what I thought my direction was. I was pouring all my energy into this servant of mine, thinking that that was God's mercy. But God had more mercy in store for me, directing me to that first big, bold dream that called me out of Dad's house and into God's mercy. When the promise doesn't seem to be lining up to the reality perfectly, do a check with how you're spending your energy. What you're focusing all your attention and energy on. Have you substituted the practical for your first love? Because when you do, your energy will go to something that never lined up with the promise in the first place. Trust me, God won't settle for the practical. He didn't in my life. Why would He in your life? He's got bigger, bolder plans for you. You shouldn't waste your energy there, because even if you achieve it, even if you achieve that practical little small life that you've always dreamed of, you just have a small life. And it's empty. It's not filled with all that God has wanted for you. I did that. I went for the practical and small, and that's what was so good about that dark sky filled with stars. I knew where my energy belonged, and I knew that my life was wasted if I didn't give it all I had. And here's the thing, God called that faithfulness. Me directing my energy to my dreams was faithful. And then all of a sudden, God's story and my story came together. So you are my future. You're what becomes of my decision. Where do you feel called out of the rut and into a big, bold life? That's probably God at work in you. And if it feels like it's not working out, where have you compromised and let your energy get redirected to something less than your biggest dreams? To something smaller that you could handle. Because God explodes those limited possibilities. God opens us up to bigger things. And besides, if you set aside the biggest dreams of God for your life to accomplish something smaller, what do you get at the end of that? Something small. And God dreams for more for you. God dreamed more for me as Abraham than I could ever have imagined. And as soon as I turned all my energy towards that dream of God for my life, I hadn't even got there yet. Hadn't got all the descendants. I hadn't even gotten one son. As soon as I channeled my energy towards that dream of God, He said to me, "Attaboy, Abraham." Now that's what I call right living. And you know what? I kind of got it. I kind of understood what he was getting at. It wasn't so much about the destination. God has that handled. But the right living was where my energy was directed at. What I was trying to do in response to this big, bold promise that God had made for me. What are you going to do when the promises of God don't seem to line up with your experience of life? It will happen. I see your future. I couldn't see mine, but because it happened, I know what yours is going to look like. Sometimes the promises will be filled with pitfalls and challenges and dreams and possibility, and you're not really sure what's real and what's not. But can you see your future in mine? God answered the promise in me. Here's what I'd tell you from my experience. God will answer the promise in you too. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Let us pray. Holy God, sometimes you scare us with the things that you ask us to do. Sometimes we don't want to imagine that our story is like Abraham's story. But you remind us that we are his future and we exist because he said yes. And there's a future for us out there on the other side of right living, on the other side of directing our energy towards that big, bold promise that you have made to us in Jesus Christ. And it's there. It exists. You ask us only to put our energy towards it. To not compromise or hedge our bets or settle for something practical. To turn towards you. To trust those promises. And to recognize that just as you answered the call for Abraham and Sarah, and we exist because you keep your promises, you will do the same for us. And our future in Christ is secure. And there is a future and a kingdom and a glory that exists for us as well. Give us the strength to live right. To give our energy over to whatever part of that future that you have called us to. We pray all of this in Jesus' name. Amen.